Picture a flat red plain in the dead centre of Australia, stretching in every direction without interruption, and sitting on top of it, balanced on the bare earth as though someone placed them there deliberately, are hundreds of enormous spherical granite boulders. Some are the size of cars, some are the size of houses. One of them is balanced on a surface contact point so small that engineers who have actually measured it cannot fully explain why it has not fallen over yet. Scientists who studied this place in depth did not find what they expected. What they found instead rewrote the way geologists understand an entire category of rock formation, and the oldest explanation for why this place exists was sitting with the traditional owners the entire time. What you're actually looking at, if you have driven the Stuart Highway between Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, you have seen them. You cannot miss them. They appear on the horizon before you can make out any detail, dark rounded shapes rising out of the spinifex, and red earth like something a giant left behind after a game nobody has ever been able to identify the rules of. Which, as it turns out, is not entirely far from what the Warramungu people have been saying about this place for an extremely long time. More on that shortly. The formation sits roughly 115 kilometres south of Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory, in some of the most geologically ancient country on the planet. The reserve covering the site is small by Australian outback standards, just over 1,800 hectares, which sounds like a lot until you realise it is a fairly modest parcel of land, surrounded by hundreds of kilometres of open desert in every direction. Within that reserve, distributed across a landscape that from the air looks like someone dropped an enormous bag of marbles and simply walked away, are somewhere between several hundred and over 1,000 individual boulders, depending on how you count the fragments and partial formations sitting alongside the more obviously spherical ones. The largest individual boulders reach 6 meters in diameter. To put that in context, a standard door frame is roughly 2 meters high. The biggest rocks here are 3 door frames stacked on top of each other, and they are roughly that shape in every direction simultaneously. Not oblong, not irregular, spherical, or close enough to spherical that the difference is not obvious, until you are standing directly next to one with a measuring tape, which several researchers have been. What makes the visual so immediately striking is the contrast. There is no mountain here, no cliff face, no obvious source for the material. The surrounding plain is flat and red, and covered with low scrub and spinifex grass, and then, without any particular geological warning, there are hundreds of enormous rounded granite boulders sitting on it. Some are solitary, some are stacked 2 or 3 high, some have split cleanly down the middle, the two halves sitting exactly where they fell, like a hard-boiled egg somebody sliced open and left on the kitchen bench. The colour shifts across the day in ways that take most visitors by surprise. At midday under direct sun they read as warm orange-red. At sunrise and sunset the same rocks go through amber, deep red, and in the last few minutes of light before dark, something close to purple. This is the point in the script where I would normally tell you not to visit at midday in summer. It is 45 degrees out there, and the rocks absorb heat all day. You will not enjoy it. Come in the cooler months, bring more water than you think you need. This has been your one practical travel tip for the episode. The name that was always wrong. The name most Australians grew up using for this place is Devil's Marbles. It is a colonial era name, the kind of name that tells you a great deal about the person who attached it, and very little about the place itself. The origin of the name is generally attributed to John Ross, a surveyor who passed through the area in 1873 during the construction of the Overland Telegraph Line. Ross reportedly described the boulders as the Devil's Marbles in his journal, a casual observation that somehow became the official designation for the next century and a half. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. A man passed through on a construction project, looked at a landscape that had been named, understood, and actively managed by Aboriginal people for tens of thousands of years, wrote a throwaway line in a journal comparing it to children's toys, and that description became the name that appeared on every map, every road sign, and every tourism brochure for the next 150 years. The traditional name is Karlu Karlu. The Warramungu, Kaitetje, Alyawari, and Walpiri peoples are the traditional custodians of this country. Karlu Karlu is generally understood to translate as rounded boulders, a description that is both accurate and considerably more dignified than marbles. The name does not require a supernatural villain as a reference point, it simply describes what is there, which, when you think about it, is exactly what a good name should do. In 2008, the Northern Territory government formally dual-named the site Karlu Karlu and Devil's Marbles Conservation Reserve, acknowledging both the traditional name and the century-plus of usage the colonial name had accumulated. This was not a purely symbolic gesture. It came attached to a formal handback of the land to traditional owners, which we will get to in detail, but the name itself matters because it reflects a fundamentally different relationship with this landscape, one that did not need a supernatural explanation to make the place feel significant, because the place was always significant on its own terms. What the Warramungu have always known. The Warramungu understand Karlu Karlu through dreaming stories that encode specific, verifiable knowledge about this landscape in a form that has survived transmission across an enormous span of time. One of the most widely shared accounts describes the rounded boulders as the eggs of the rainbow serpent at Ninga laid across the landscape during the creation period. In this telling, the serpent moved through this country during the dreaming, and the boulders mark both the path of that movement and the physical evidence of the serpent's presence, eggs left behind in the red earth that hardened into stone. This is not simply a poetic metaphor. The description of the boulders as eggs is, as we will get to shortly, a more precise physical description of what is happening to the granite here than anything John Ross wrote in his journal. The Warramungu were describing a geological process in the language available to them. The language was different from the one geologists use. The underlying observation was not. Karlu Karlu is classified as a sacred site under the Northern Territory Aboriginal Sacred Sites Act. This is not a blanket classification applied loosely to any place traditional owners find significant. It reflects a specific legally recognized determination that this landscape carries particular ceremonial and spiritual importance. The site contains distinct areas designated for men's ceremonies and women's ceremonies, and access to those specific areas is governed by traditional law rather than general park regulation. Traditional owners do not simply visit Karlu Karlu, they hold custodial responsibility for it. The Warramungu and the other custodial groups understand themselves as accountable for what happens here in ways that go well beyond the kind of connection most tourists bring to a national park. There are stories held by traditional owners about this place that are not shared publicly, and there is no reasonable expectation that they should be. Some knowledge belongs to specific people by right of birth and ceremony, and a YouTube channel is not the appropriate vehicle for that transmission. What can be said is that the accumulated traditional knowledge of this landscape encompasses specific understandings of its physical behavior, its seasonal changes, and its ceremonial geography that took thousands of generations to develop, and that researchers who have engaged directly with traditional owners have described as genuinely scientifically informative, a point the geological research ended up confirming in ways nobody initially predicted. How old is old, dating the formation at Karlu? Karlu requires sitting comfortably with the kind of numbers that the human brain is genuinely not built to process at the intuitive level. The granite underlying the boulders belongs to a formation called the Warramungu granite, a body of rock that crystallized from magma deep underground approximately 1,700,000,000 years ago. Not million, billion. To place that on a timeline, the planet Earth itself formed approximately 4,500,000,000 years ago. The granite at Karlu Karlu solidified from magma when Earth was less than halfway through its current lifespan. Single-celled organisms were the most complex life on the planet at that point. Plants did not exist. Animals did not exist. The oxygen content of the atmosphere was a fraction of what it is today. The granite was already there, cooling slowly underground, while the planet was still working out the basic logistics of multicellular life. The spheroidal shapes the boulders have today did not form at that point. They are the product of weathering processes that have been operating on the exposed granite over a much more recent timescale, geologically speaking, roughly 300 to 600 million years, for the initial underground chemical weathering that produced the rounded shapes, followed by ongoing surface exposure and continued weathering over the last tens of millions of years as the overlying rock eroded away. This means the boulders you can walk up and touch at Karlu Karlu today are not just old in the way that a medieval cathedral is old, or even in the way that a dinosaur fossil is old. The material you are touching solidified from magma before complex animal life existed anywhere on this planet. It has been sitting in the landscape in its current approximate form since before the first fish crawled out of the ocean. And it will almost certainly still be here in modified form long after every structure human civilization has ever built has been ground to dust and recycled into the geology. This is the part where I find it genuinely useful to sit quietly for a moment. Feel free to do the same. The discovery that shocked geologists now. Here is where it gets genuinely interesting for geologists, and I mean that in the full, excited scientist sense of the phrase. For most of the time that Karlu Karlu has been documented in Western scientific literature, the explanation for the boulder's spherical shapes was assumed to be straightforward. The process is called spheroidal weathering, and the basic mechanism is well understood. When rectangular blocks of granite are exposed to water that penetrates along the natural joint planes in the rock, a chemical process called hydrolysis attacks the corners and edges of each block more aggressively than the flat faces, because corners and edges have more surface area in contact with the water relative to their volume. Over time, the corners round off, then the edges, and eventually a roughly rectangular block of granite becomes a roughly spherical one. The round shape is the most stable configuration the rock can reach, the point at which every surface is equidistant from the center and the weathering rate across the whole surface equalizes. This is not a controversial process. It happens in granite formations all over the world. The reason Karlu Karlu became a landmark case study in geological literature, rather than just another interesting boulder field, is what researchers found when they looked beneath the surface. In research that was published and peer-reviewed, geologists conducting subsurface mapping at Karlu Karlu found that the spheroidal weathering process here had operated at a depth and on a scale that was significantly beyond what standard models had predicted for this type of formation. The joint spacing in the Warrumungu granite, the natural fracture network through which water penetrates and begins the weathering process, had produced a pattern of chemical weathering underground that was far more regular and far more geometrically consistent than the models predicted. What this means in practice is that the shapes you see at the surface today are not the result of random irregular weathering producing accidental spheres. They are the product of a systematic underground process operating with a geometric regularity that the surface appearance does not immediately suggest. The subsurface work revealed that directly beneath the exposed boulders, in the zone of rock that has not yet been uncovered by erosion of the surrounding material, there are further rounded forms already in development. The weathering front is active. The boulders visible today are simply the ones that happen to have been uncovered so far. There are more in various stages of the same process sitting in the rock directly below the current surface. Karlu Karlu is not a finished product. It is a process that is still running. This finding had significant implications for how geologists model spheroidal weathering in granite formations generally. The site became a reference point specifically because the conditions there, the joint spacing, the granite composition, the long-term hydrology of the region, had produced an unusually clear and well-preserved example of the process operating at depth before surface exposure. It is, for geological researchers, the equivalent of being able to watch a process that usually only shows you its end results from the beginning. The other finding that generated genuine scientific attention was the degree to which the surface forms at Karlu Karlu matched predictions made by the subsurface modelling. In most granite boulder fields, there is significant variation between individual boulders that is difficult to account for using weathering models alone, suggesting that local variations in rock composition, fracture patterns, or water access have created significant irregularities in the process. At Karlu Karlu, the match between the predicted forms based on the joint pattern modelling and the actual observed shapes of the boulders was remarkably close. Close enough that researchers specifically noted it as evidence that the Warramungu granite here had an unusually consistent internal structure, making this site a cleaner example of the theoretical process than most comparable formations anywhere else in the world. The egg that shouldn't exist. There is one boulder at Karlu Karlu that deserves its own chapter. Most visitors walk past it without realizing that the specific rock they are looking at has been generating arguments in geological literature for decades. It sits balanced on a contact surface that, when measured properly, is substantially smaller than the geometry of the boulder itself should theoretically allow. The boulder is large. The contact point with the surface below it is small. The mathematics of the situation suggest it should not be in stable equilibrium. Engineers and geologists who have examined it have proposed various explanations, including the possibility that the visible contact surface is not the full contact area, that internal compaction of the rock below the visible surface is distributing the load across a wider area than the outside appearance suggests. This explanation is plausible and probably correct. The boulder has been sitting there for an amount of time that makes any immediate concern about its structural stability feel slightly ridiculous. It was balanced in roughly this configuration before human beings were walking through this part of Australia. It is almost certainly going to be balanced there long after this video has been forgotten, but the specific geometry of it continues to generate discussion because it sits at the edge of what the standard weathering models produce as a normal output. The standard models predict spherical boulders with reasonably stable base contact. They do not cleanly predict this particular configuration, and the gap between what the models predict and what is actually sitting on the red earth is exactly where the most productive geological arguments tend to happen. What the cracking sounds mean. If you visit Karlu Karlu at night and you are not alarmed by darkness and silence in approximately equal measure, you will hear something that takes a moment to identify. The rocks crack, not dramatically, not like a gunshot or a landslide. It is a sharp, percussive sound, a tick or a pop coming from somewhere inside the stone, and it happens repeatedly across the boulder field as the temperature drops after sunset. This is thermal expansion and contraction operating on a geological scale in real time. During the day, the dark granite surface absorbs an enormous amount of heat from the Northern Territory sun. Surface temperatures on the boulders themselves can reach 70 degrees Celsius or above on a hot day. At night, the surface temperature drops rapidly, sometimes by 30 or 40 degrees within a few hours. The rock expands when it heats and contracts when it cools, and the rate at which the surface temperature changes is substantially faster than the rate at which the interior temperature of the boulder can catch up. This creates a differential stress between the outer layer of the rock and the interior, a stress that is released in small sudden increments as the surface contracts faster than the core. Over geological time, this process is one of the mechanisms contributing to the further rounding of the boulders. The outer layers are being mechanically stressed every single day, and eventually thin sheets of rock break away from the surface in a process called exfoliation, peeling off in curved sheets that reveal fresh granite underneath. The curved sheets themselves are evidence of the spherical geometry driving the process. A flat surface under the same thermal stress would crack differently. The curvature of the exfoliating sheets is a direct physical signature of the spherical form producing it. The sounds at night are not incidental atmosphere. They are the process continuing. The boulders are actively changing shape right now at a rate too slow for any individual human life to meaningfully observe, but at a rate that is real and measurable and ongoing. The ceremonial landscape. Nobody told tourists about most visitors to Karlu Karlu experience the site from the marked walking trails that loop around the main boulder clusters. The trails are well maintained, and the signage is genuinely informative by the standards of Australian outback national parks. What the signage cannot fully convey, and what most visitors leave without understanding, is that the boulders themselves represent only the most visually obvious element of a ceremonial landscape that extends well beyond what the walking trails cover. The full ceremonial geography of Karlu Karlu encompasses specific boulders and boulder groupings that carry distinct meanings within Warramungu ceremony and law. Particular formations are associated with specific dreaming tracks, the invisible pathways across the landscape along which ancestral beings are understood to have travelled during the creation period, leaving the physical features of the country as a permanent record of their movement. Some of these tracks converge at Karlu Karlu from considerable distances, making the site not simply a local sacred location, but a node in a much wider ceremonial network connecting multiple language groups across a substantial area of Central Australia. The site contains areas designated for men's business and areas designated for women's business, and the specific content of what occurs in those spaces is governed by traditional law. The existence of this division is publicly documented. The content is not and should not be. What is documented is that the ceremonial use of this landscape has been continuous. The practices conducted here are not historical reconstructions or cultural performances for an outside audience. They are living ceremonial obligations maintained by the custodial groups across generations and continuing in the present day. There is an additional layer that most visitors never encounter. Karlu Karlu is associated with specific mortuary practices in Warramungu tradition. The relationship between this site and the ceremonies surrounding death within the custodial communities is one of the aspects of the site's significance that traditional owners have chosen not to share in detail with the general public for reasons that are entirely their prerogative to hold. What is publicly known is that the association exists, that it is part of what makes this landscape significant beyond its visual drama, and that it represents a category of cultural knowledge that the standard tourist experience of the boulder field does not touch. This is worth sitting with. What most people see when they visit is the surface, the boulders, the red earth, the photogenic balance points. The landscape underneath that surface in the cultural sense is deeper and older and considerably more complex than anything the walking trail interpretation panels can communicate. That is not a criticism of the park management. It is simply an honest account of the gap between what a tourist site can transmit and what a living ceremonial landscape actually contains. The land rights. Battle that changed Australia. The political history of Karlu Karlu is inseparable from the wider history of land rights in Australia, and that history is not a comfortable one to summarise briefly without doing it a disservice. The short version is this: Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory did not have formal legal recognition of their connection to their traditional country for most of the 20th century. The land at Karlu Karlu, land that the Warramungu and associated groups had held custodial responsibility for across an unbroken span of thousands of years, was classified as Crown land under the colonial legal framework, meaning it belonged to the government, and the traditional owner's relationship to it had no standing in law. The Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976 passed under the Whitlam and then Fraser governments after years of political campaigning by Aboriginal communities and their supporters, created a formal legal mechanism through which traditional owners could claim title to unalienated Crown land in the Northern Territory. It was a significant piece of legislation, widely described as the most important recognition of Aboriginal land rights in Australian history to that point. It was also, in practical terms, a partial and complicated measure that left a great deal of sacred and significant land outside its reach, including, for decades, Karlu Karlu itself. The reserve at Karlu Karlu remained under Northern Territory Parks management without formal handback to traditional owners for many years after the land rights framework was established. The process of negotiating the handback was long, involved multiple government agencies, and required the traditional owners to formally document their connection to the site through a process that many Aboriginal land rights advocates have described as requiring people to prove what should not have required proof. In 2008, the formal handback occurred. The Karlu Karlu and Devil's Marbles Conservation Reserve was handed back to traditional owners in a ceremony attended by representatives of the custodial groups, government officials, and members of the public. The traditional owners immediately leased the land back to the Northern Territory government for continued management as a conservation reserve, ensuring public access was maintained while establishing formal legal recognition of traditional ownership. This arrangement, handback followed by leaseback, has become a standard model for managing jointly significant sites in the Northern Territory, and Karlu Karlu is frequently cited as one of the cleaner examples of it working as intended. What the handback meant in practical terms was not primarily a change in the day-to-day experience of visiting the site. The walking trails remained, the camping ground remained, the interpretive signage remained. What changed was the legal architecture underneath the tourism experience. The question of who held formal responsibility for this country was finally answered in the way it should always have been, which is worth noting plainly even if it took until 2008 to get there. What scientists are still working out. The geological research at Karlu has not stopped. The site has generated enough interest in the scientific literature that it continues to attract researchers working on questions that the initial subsurface mapping raised without fully resolving. One of the more active areas of current investigation involves the relationship between the regional hydrology and the weathering front identified below the current surface. The rate at which the subsurface weathering is progressing depends on the availability of water penetrating through the joint system in the granite, and that water availability is in turn dependent on rainfall patterns that have varied significantly across the deep geological history of Central Australia. The region is arid now. It was not always arid. During periods of higher rainfall in the geological past, the weathering process would have operated considerably faster and penetrated considerably deeper than it does under current conditions. Researchers are working to reconstruct the timeline of weathering activity at the site by correlating the observed forms with paleoclimate data covering the last several million years, an effort that is expected to produce a much more detailed picture of how and when the specific boulder shapes visible today actually developed. A separate line of research involves the thermal behavior of the boulders, specifically the role of thermal cycling in the long-term evolution of the surface forms. The crack sounds at night are a qualitative observation. Turning them into quantitative data, measuring the actual stress loads generated by the daily temperature cycling, the rate of exfoliation, and the contribution of thermal fracturing to the overall weathering rate requires instrumentation attached directly to the boulders over extended monitoring periods. This work has begun, and early results are expected to refine the models significantly. There is also ongoing collaborative research between geologists and Warramungu knowledge holders, an area of investigation that has moved slowly and carefully out of respect for the sensitivity of some of the traditional knowledge involved, but that has produced what researchers involved have described as genuinely productive cross-disciplinary insights. The traditional understanding of the landscape's behavior, accumulated over thousands of generations of direct observation, has in several documented instances identified patterns and phenomena that the formal scientific record had not yet caught up with. This is not a surprising finding to anyone who has spent time thinking carefully about what 50,000 years of continuous observation of a single landscape actually produces. It is, however, a finding that the geological community has historically been slow to take seriously, and the work at Karlu Karlu is among the better examples of what happens when that changes. Go back to the image at the start of this, the flat red plain, the rounded boulders balanced on the earth, the one sitting on a contact point that engineers cannot fully explain. Here is what you are actually looking at. You are looking at a process that began 1,700,000,000 years ago when magma cooled underground in a planet that had not yet figured out how to build an animal. You are looking at a weathering front that is still active below the surface, you can see, producing new rounded forms in the rock that will not be exposed until the material above them erodes away over the next several million years. You are looking at a landscape that cracks audibly every night as the temperature drops, peeling thin curved sheets from the surface of each boulder in an ongoing sculptural process that has no particular endpoint and no particular urgency. And you are looking at a place that the Warramungu have always called Karlu Karlu, rounded boulders, a name that contains more accurate geological description than the journal entry of a surveyor who passed through in 1873 and reached for a children's toy as his reference point. The dreaming stories described these rocks as eggs. The geological research confirmed that the granite is producing spherical forms through a process operating with the regularity and consistency of something that almost looks, if you are willing to entertain the comparison, like it was designed to work out that way. The traditional owners held custodial responsibility for a billion-year-old process they described through the language of creation. The scientists arrived much later and confirmed, using different language and different tools, that the description was not wrong. The oldest name was always the most accurate one. It usually is. If this is the first time you have heard Karlu Karlu described as what it actually is, rather than what a colonial surveyor decided to call it, leave it in the comments below and subscribe for more ancient Australian history that most people were never properly taught.